The scripture reading that Bob read from Haggai was one that is set in a particular context. If you remember that at a time of great tumult and thunderous war, where the armies of Babylon came into the Middle East, practicing the earliest form of shock and awe, where just the size of the army alone would create a tremor in the earth as it moved for miles ahead of time. And the number of draft animals and personnel and support personnel involved would, like locusts, just absorb all of the resources of the invaded area for years to come to recover. And they took over Jerusalem, and they absorbed the intelligentsia and the royalty and the artists, and took them to Babylon into captivity. And then in time, Persia took over from Babylon and released the captives after 5 generations to return to Jerusalem. And they got back all these highfalutin folks, the educated, the talented, the gifted, their grandchildren rather came back, great-grandchildren, to reclaim Jerusalem as their birthright, and found out that in 5 generations, the average ordinary people had gotten along without them quite well, thank you very, very much. And their services really weren't needed or required anymore. And there was more conflict. And in the midst of that conflict was a decision by the king, who was king by birthright, to rebuild the priesthood and rebuild the temple. And so that work began. And this is the way in which Haggai says God shook things up. Shook things up. The heavens and the earth would be changed and shaken up. And we have some sense of that. We have some sense of how these big events in world history shake things up. And sometimes we understand it in terms of God's guidance, command, or whatever, and sometimes we simply just put up with it, endure it. Even in our own personal lives, of course, we understand that these big occasions of life, birth, death, celebration shake things up and change things for us. But on a worldwide scale, we have this other thing going on. Nothing is ever the same again. And very often we understand the big things and the great things and even the terrible things in terms of God's will and God's command, and that's where we leave it sit. And we don't understand. We constantly miss the fact that in Christian faith, the sign and symbol of God's living presence is not big things. Okay? It's not St. Peter's Cathedral. It's not huge gatherings of massive numbers of people. The sign and symbol of God's living presence is a little piece of bread that you can put in your pocket and carry around. We constantly forget, we constantly misunderstand that in the midst of these huge world events, the presence of God is not in the bombs that are dropping, is not in the death of those who serve their countries, whether they're our enemies or us. The sign and symbol of God's living presence is the little surprise that's in the mix. The moment of compassion. The establishment of something better out of the rubble. One of the best arguments for our involvement in Afghanistan has been the very possibility of building schools and hospitals in the midst of all these terrible things that go on. And so I thought about that a little bit. I thought about God's presence in the little things and how things shake things up. And I thought, well, what's an example of that? And I remembered a song that I used to sing a long, long time ago. I thought I'd share it with you today. It goes back to World War I. I think it was just last summer that the last Canadian World War I vet died. Am I correct? Typical Canadian World War I vet died in California. Anyway, World War I was a war that nobody really remembers and we can't really understand because it was entirely an imperial war, right? It was basically kings fighting kings, royalty fighting royalty. And average people like us were thrown into the mix. And the thing is that, yes, they were loyal to their countries, but they understood this. They really did understand that. And the high command on both sides, both the German alliance and on the Allied side, had a heck of a time for the troops the first year or so. You know why? Well, they fight each other, they kill each other, but they kept breaking out into peace. They kept having these spontaneous moments of disarmament. Who's ever heard of that? Yeah, very few people. It's actually been suppressed for decades and decades. It now appears that as many as 100,000 soldiers on both sides of the bayonet took part in spontaneous moments of disarmament, and they get together and play hockey games. Yeah, they played hockey. Played soccer games on the no man's land field, and they traded goods and photographs and all kinds of other things. So a guy named John McCutcheon got a hold of this story before it became even remotely well known, when it was still fairly well suppressed, actually, over 20 years ago, and wrote this song called Christmas in the Trenches about one such event. Now, he gets a few things wrong because he talks about gas clouds rolling, and what stopped these spontaneous events of peace was the gas. Trading poisonous gas basically killed the opportunity for peace between the two sides. But the rest of it is still a song that says something about God shaking things up from the little place. Just checking to see if Doug changed my tuning. My name is Francis Tolliver. I come from Liverpool. 2 years ago, the war was waiting for me after school. To Belgium and to Flanders, Germany to here. I fought for king and country I loved dear. 'Twas Christmas in the trenches where the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were still, no Christmas song was sung. Our families back in England were toasting us that day, the brave and glorious lads so far away. I was lying with my messmate on the cold and rocky ground when across the lines of battle came a most peculiar sound. Says I, now listen up, me boys, each soldier strained to hear, as one young German voice sang out so clear. He's singing bloody well, you know, my partner says to me. Soon one by one each German voice joined in harmony. The cannons rested silent, the gas clouds rolled no more, as Christmas brought us respite from the war. As soon as they were finished, reverent pause was spent, God rest ye merry gentlemen, struck up some lads from Kent. Oh, the next they sang was still enough, 'tis silent night, says I, and in two tongues one song filled up that sky. There's someone coming toward us, the frontline sentry cried. All sights were fixed on one lone figure trudging from their side. His truce flag like a Christmas star shone on that plain so bright, as he bravely strolled unarmed into the night. The one by one on either side walked into no man's land. With neither gun nor bayonet, we met there hand to hand. We shared some secret brandy. We wished each other well. And in a flare-lit soccer game, we gave 'em hell. We traded chocolate, cigarettes, and photographs from home. These sons and fathers far away from families of their own. Young Saunders played the squeeze box, and they had a violin. This curious and unlikely band of men. Soon daylight stole upon us. France is France once more. With sad farewells, we each began to settle back to war. But the question haunted every heart that lived that wondrous night: what family have I fixed within my sights? 'Twas Christmas in the trenches where the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were warm as songs of peace were sung. For the walls they kept between us to exact the work of war have been crumbled and were gone forevermore. My name is Francis Tolliver. In Liverpool I dwell. Each Christmas come since World War I, I've learned its lessons well. For the ones who call the shots won't be among the dead and lame, and on each end of the rifle we're the same.